And that was the night when for the first time I felt that it was granted, sort of, that I had the right, that I would be able to, in effect, to become Kunta Kinte. And that part is in the book. And if you read Roots, if you remember when you get to the part how it was written, as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think the lead line in that section is Kunta wondered if he was going mad. And that really was me at that time. I wondered if I was losing my mind.
Because of the new interest in genealogy spurred on by Alex Haley and Roots, we now know that President Jimmy Carter's first American forebearer arrived in Virginia 341 years ago in 1635, just 16 years after the first blacks had arrived in Jamestown, Virginia as free men and women. Like many penniless Englishmen, Thomas Carter Sr. sold himself into bondage to pay his passage to the colonies and suffered as a slave for 5 years. Alex Haley has indeed placed a historical parameter for all Americans to use as a point of historical reference.
Today we are learning about Alex Haley. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.
A Los Angeles disco club closed its doors because so many of its patrons wanted to watch Roots, and the 8-part dramatization of Alex Haley's book reached more American viewers than any television show in history. The statistic is even more significant to Americans than it is to the television industry, because the Nielsen ratings are based on a sample that is around 85% white. The ad said it took 200 years to unfold, 12 years of research to discover, 2 years to create, and 8 nights to make television history. P.J. Bednarski, TV critic of the Journal Herald in Dayton, Ohio, explains it another way. Quote, "For 8 straight nights and 12 hours, 130 million Americans were riveted to the set to watch the sorriest chapter in American history. Roots was not Happy Days or Charlie's Angels, which are produced with enough plasticity and universal appeal that no viewer has truly ever become offended, nor truly moved, amused, or touched." End of quote. Speaking of plasticity, many of us thought it poetic justice that John Amos got kicked out as the father of the plastic Amos and Andy situation comedy called Good Times and reappeared as Kunta Kinte, the new father of the Black Revolution and a real MAN. But Roots didn't succeed in becoming the most watched program in the history of television because it only appealed to blacks, although it showed that the majority of blacks endured terrible dehumanization. The fact that they overcame shattered hopes and deferred dreams without succumbing to a mass psychosis is the most triumphant story of America's bicentennial. Why did so many whites watch Roots? Because Roots appealed to a broad audience on human and universal terms.
Can you do me a favor? Tell me some stories about what happened when Roots first came out. I remember talking to my mother about this movie, and she told me that her brother, my uncle, had a teacher named Mr. Moore, and he got suspended the very next day because he went to school telling the teacher Master Moore or Master Mo. And from my mother's lips, she said a friend of theirs had a rope put around his neck and was unalived because of this movie. Let me know in the comments, do you know of any incidents that happened because of this movie?
Even before Roots got on the air, Time magazine's television critic warned that it was simply a highbrow mandingo with no positive white characters. I thought I was watching the wrong show when I saw in the very first segment the ship's captain, a white man whose morality and Christian ethic would not permit him to accept the insidious and evil nature of slavery. Symbolically, he struggled against the institution of slavery, as did all people of goodwill, but like most whites, got waylaid by the awesome power of this institutionalized oppression. The scene with the captain, the good guy, his slimy first mate, the evil one, and the so-called belly warmer, or his temptation, showed a human being who could not sustain his capacity to successfully hold out against an evil system, in this case, racism and slavery. But this insight came from the very soul of Alex Haley during his 12-year search for his roots, black roots, white roots, the very roots of American history. We talked to Haley before, but as you will if you don't already know, he's one of the best storytellers around. So we updated our previous talk with this visit with Alex Haley.
We, that is to say my parents and I, lived in the home of my grandmother in this little town called Henning, Tennessee. This was my maternal grandmother. And she would invite every summer various women members of the family who were about her age range, late 40s, early 50s. And they would sit on the front porch in the evening, about as dusk deepened into early night, and they would tell this family narrative. I didn't know that that's what it was. I was always with them because I was very, very close to my grandmother. They would sit there and they would talk about what, in its straight form, went back across families before us and families before them and before those to a person whom they called the African. Now, first of all, the very first thing was that my grandmother and the others, her sisters, always would speak of how they had been born in Alamance County, North Carolina, which to me for years was just a name. And then the other families had been slaves before them and so forth. Anyway, pardon me, when they got back to this African, they would always tell how he was brought on a ship to this country, to Annapolis, bought off that ship by a man named John Waller, who took the African to a plantation in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. There, this African, over a period of time, met and mated with a slave woman whose name was Belle. They had a daughter named Kizzy. It was said by Grandma and the others that as this girl grew up, when she got to be 4 or 5 or so and could begin to understand such things, that she now, this African rather, began to point out to her about the plantation various natural objects, a tree, a rock, the sky, anything. And every time he'd point out any object, he would tell her the name for that thing in his native tongue. The little girl, like any child today, hearing an alien tongue spoken, learned strange phonetic sounds, and she came to know that certain sounds meant certain things. The most important, much, much later, was that there was a river, in fact it's the Mattapony River, that ran near this plantation, and it was said that every time this African there in Virginia would point to this river, he would say to his little daughter, Cambi Bolongo, and she came to know this sound, and to know that it meant river. Cambi Bolongo meant that to her father. There were numerous other sounds. K sounds predominated. Another thing about this African that made him characteristic of all those Africans who are the ancestors of all we black people were that every one of them, when brought to this country and sold off a slave ship, were given an anglicized name. And for all practical purposes, that was the first step in the psychic dehumanization of the individual, or collectively of the people, the removal from the individual of the name with which went his or her sense of self-identity, the same as it is with us. And it seems that this African was given by his master the name Toby. But every time they said other slaves would address him as Toby, he strenuously would rebuff and reject it and tell them his name was Kinte, another K sound. So the daughter came to know he said his real African name was Kinte. Then there was another thing about this African, again characteristic of all of them in the backgrounds of all of us, and that was every single one of them had been torn from some place where they spoke whatever was their native tongue and brought to this place and expected and required to speak as quickly as possible a strange new tongue to them, English. And as this process happened, a word here, a phrase there, this African, once he acquired some repertoire, began to tell his daughter now little stories, anecdotes, vignettes about himself out of his past. It would appear, as a matter of fact, he had a passion about trying to communicate to her a sense of his past. Among the stories he told her was how he had been captured. He said he had been not far from his village chopping wood to make a drum when he had been surprised, set upon, overwhelmed by 4 men, thus had been kidnapped into slavery. Well, in the essence, those are the key points of the story, which of course had much more detail. Now, the girl Kizzy was sold away when she was 16. With now a considerable amount of knowledge about her father in her head. She was sold to a man named Tom Lee. He had a much smaller plantation in Caswell County, North Carolina. On this plantation, within her first year, the girl Kizzy gave birth to a child, a boy. He was given the name George. His father, or at least the sire, was the new master, Tom Lee, and that was not an uncommon situation in the antebellum South. As this boy, George, grew up and began to ask his mother about his father, the mother, rather than tell him who his true father was, told him instead about her father. And so the boy began to know at an early age and with pride of his grandfather, this African who said his name was Kinte, who called a river Kambi-Bolongo, who called a guitar Ko for another sound, who said he was chopping wood to make a drum when he was captured.
Be honest in the comments. How often do your family talk about your heritage, where you came from, and about the many lives before you?
Well, the boy grew up, pardon me, he became a gamecock fighter. He was nicknamed Chicken George in his middle teens. When he was about 19, he met the slave lady he later would marry, her name Matilda. Matilda gave birth to 8 children, and it was Chicken George, the father, who set into motion what later was to become a rigid family tradition, that every time a new infant was born, he would gather the family within the slave cabin in a rather formal manner, and with the infant sitting on his lap, he always had a sense of drama, this Chicken George. With the infant sitting on his lap, he would speak ostensibly to the infant, but actually to his older audience, telling the story that had come down. And for that 8 children, it was something most unusual in the knowledge of slave children. That was direct knowledge of this African great-grandfather. Then those children grew up, took mates, had children. The 4th of them, Tom, became a slave blacksmith. He was sold away in his later teens to a man named Murray, who had a tobacco plantation in Alamance County, North Carolina. And on that plantation, Tom eventually met and mated with a slave lady named Irene. She was half black, half Cherokee Indian. And they also would have 8 children. And now Tom carried on the tradition. That 8 children heard now about a great-great-grandfather, the same African who said his name was Kinte and so forth, and said he was chopping wood when captured. As fate would have it, Tony, the youngest of that second set of 8 children, hearing about this African great-great-grandfather, was a little girl named Cynthia, and fate further would have it that Cynthia was to become my maternal grandmother. And that story had come down the generations in the manner that I have described. My grandmother seemed to be the chief carrier of it. It seems every generation had one person who, for some reason, became its chief carrier. And she pumped that story into me as if it were plasma. It was by all odds the most precious thing in her life, the story of the family, which had come down, and around which the whole family coalesced.
In a psychological sense, what has it done for you as a person?
Obviously, often I'm asked that, and so I've asked myself that a lot. It really, Tony, isn't so much a sense of anything subjective in the sense of just me, not in the sense of that I'm relating just to me. But what it has done, very definitely, is almost my whole concept of the book is such that it startles me when somebody says you've traced your family. Because the way I think about it is that, in fact, it is the saga of a people. The reason for that is that every black person, no matter whom he or she may be, it is merely a matter for all of us fill in the blanks ancestrally. Which person who lived in which village, captured in which way, put into which slave ship, brought across the same ocean, into which succession of plantations on up to the Civil War, the Emancipation, and from that day to this day struggle for freedom in its various facets. So what it has given me really is, against that context, and particularly since the book has been published, the response of people to it has been so just staggering, no less than that, that I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility that somehow I have been, I hate to say it because it sounds so funny, but I really feel I have been almost elected by obviously a force beyond me or us or whatever, that I have been sort of a conduit through which has been told the history of a people in the time that it's needed. Let me tell you something. The other night, I was up at Abyssinian Baptist Church, night before last. The place, Tony, was so packed that it literally was a problem for me and Lenny Jeffers to get through the people to get up to the pulpit or that area. They were giving a testimonial to me for Roots. I sat up there, and it may sound maudlin, I don't care. I sat up there, and the place was blurry because it was just weepy to me. The whole spectacle of people having come from, there were buses of people who'd come from New Jersey. There were people from Harlem. There were people from around, you know, drawn by the lure of the magnet of Roots, our roots, my roots and such. There were many books. Lenny and them had gotten books from Doubleday, and I'm sitting there signing books as rapidly as I can. And things were happening. Friends have told me subsequently, George Sims, my researcher, was sort of peripheral, so he's watching this and that and the other. He told me about a thing. He said he watched a lady, an old lady, come in there, and he said what first caught his attention was when she went up where they were selling the books, and she went in her bosom, like old people will, and brought out crumpled bills. You've seen that syndrome. And she counted out $70 and bought 7 books. They had them at a reduced thing. And then he said what he happened to notice that hit him so much, he happened to notice the lady's feet. And he said that lady needed shoes. But she had bought these 7 books. Now, where I picked the thing up, I remember the lady when she came to me. I remember when she put the first book down, and I'm sitting there with my head down kind of signing, and I saw book Roots in 2 hands, and what struck me was I looked at the fingers, and I have seen those fingers hundreds of times. The fingers of an old black lady, finely serrated. They've been in so many wash tubs. The knuckles a little knobby, so forth. And something hit my head. These hands have not usually been buying books. And that lady came there, and she was almost aglow. And she asked if I would sign these 7 books. And what it turned out, she wanted 1 for each of her 6 children.
Can you let me know in the comments, what was the name of the first book you've ever bought? If you don't know the name of the first one, give me the last one.
And 1 for herself and her husband. I would guess this lady was late 60s. And I tell you the truth, I had the feeling I wanted to spring up and embrace her. I didn't know what to do, so I just signed the books and so forth. There was a young blind man that came on the subway from Brooklyn with $10 in his cane to buy a book, things like that. And you can't have things like that happen without one knowing you did not alone bring this into being, this thing. No way did you bring it into being. And you cannot have things like that happen without feeling a real, true, genuine sense of humility, of responsibility, and of being a conduit through which has been brought something that a people badly needed.
Tell me the details of the actual ship, the name of the ship that Kuna Kente came on, the conditions, and how many whites were on it, how many slaves, and the cargo.
Yeah, she was the Lord Ligonier, built in 1765 in this country, sailed from here with a skeletal crew of 16, her captain Thomas Davies, to Gravesend, England. She carried a cargo of rum. She sold the rum, or they did, and bought with the proceeds the slaving hardware, the chains, shackles, and so forth. This was a maiden voyage, see. And they bought the foodstuffs you need for a slaving voyage. They put on a full crew, total 36. The Lord Ligonier, at the end of 10 months, had a cargo of 3,265 elephant's teeth, as they call ivory tusks, 3,700 pounds of beeswax, 800 pounds of raw cotton, 42 ounces of gold, and 140 Africans. And she set sail with that cargo July 5th, 1767. Sailed directly to Annapolis, arrived the morning of September 29th, 1767, a journey of 2 months, 3 weeks, 2 days. And when she arrived in Annapolis, I went there and I found the records of her incoming and tax records. You can find them back to the time of Christ, generally, in researching. And she had declared for taxes. They'd been very honest, apparently. Everything they had declared leaving Africa with the exception that the original 140 Africans had become 98 who had lived, which was about average for the slave ships. Now, an interesting little side point, Tony, is that on slave ships, as a rule, percentage-wise, more whites died than slaves. This ship would illustrate it. She had left England with a full crew of 36, and she arrived in Annapolis with 18 alive, as opposed to 98 living out of the 140 slaves. And there in Annapolis, those 98 were sold at auction at Meigs Wharf the following Wednesday after her arrival, and that was where the boy 17, Kunta Kinte, was sold to John Waller of Spotsylvania County, Virginia.
The response to our first interview with Alex Haley went like this. Bernie Harrison wrote in the Washington Star. He, Alex Haley, taped a moving, extraordinary interview for Black Journal. It's really not so much an interview as a monologue. Host Tony Brown simply got Haley started and wisely got out of the way. It just poured out. End of quote. Benjamin Hooks, FCC commissioner and new head of the NAACP, wrote in his syndicated column, quote, in a candid interview with Tony Brown, Haley revealed the agony he suffered before finally completing the book, which took him 12 years of tough and patient research to write. I believe Alex Haley was touched by God that day. I suffered with Haley as he talked on that TV show. End of quote. And Mike Drew of the Milwaukee Journal wrote in his review, quote, an important look at an important and impressive man. End of quote. This is what took place.
Haley was in personal and creative agony, worried about his personal debts and his lack of emotional grasp of Kunta Kinte. Both descended upon him in a period of either temporary insanity or perhaps a psychic experience. It started in San Francisco. Haley found it impossible to capture on paper the agony, the pain, the despair that Kunta Kinte had felt in the whole of that slave ship. Haley flew to Africa and booked passage on the African Star, sailing out of the West African port of Monrovia, Liberia. On board, he made an unusual arrangement with the captain.
It worked out that after dinner every evening, I would go down into the second hold of the ship. I don't know if you've been down in ship holds, but they're deep, dark, cavernous, cold. And I was in a place where they had cargo of bales of raw rubber out of Liberia. And I found a big timber. It's maybe as wide as this table and long as from here to the backdrop, or longer than that, twice that long.
Tell me about something in the comments that you experienced that left you a little shook.
Dunnage, they call it. They store it between cargo to keep it from shifting. And I would take off my clothing, down to my underwear anyway, and lie on my back on this rough plank. And it's, as I say, dark, pitch dark, cold. And I would make myself stay there and stay in that particular posture as well. Uncomfortably, it wasn't freezing, but uncomfortably cold. I'd make myself stay there until in the morning I could hear footsteps on the steel deck up overhead. And then I'd come out and I'd go in my stateroom. Now, what I was trying to do was psych myself into becoming Kunta Kinte for the purpose of working. I had researched to a fare thee well. I have read more stuff about slave ships, I guess, than anybody who ever captained a slave. I know I have done that. But anyway, I've done thorough research on slave ships and the maritime industry and the whole, everything which would relate to. Now the thing was to get Kunta to become the embodiment as the recipient of his situation on that ship. Tell it from his point of view, through his five senses. And the thing started to get me in such a trauma, Tony, that about the fourth evening, instead of going from dinner to the hold, I really didn't want to go down there. I mean, it was, I knew it was a nice try, but I felt it was still ridiculous. It was utter luxury by the way they were coming over. There was no way I could recreate the way the slaves actually came. And for some reason, instead of going down the hold, I had just sort of drifted out back onto the fantail or the stern of the ship. It curves and all. And it was just night, dark. And I stood there and put one foot up on the bottom rail, the hands on the top rail, kind of looking back over the wake. And it seemed to me that as I did that, all my troubles began to roll in on me. I mean, it was just like endless. It was like being caught in the tide with your feet tethered or something, that the trauma of what I was trying to do, the hopelessness, it seemed, of what I was trying to do, the impossibility, I should say, of actually achieving what I was trying to do in the sense of to feel like him. And then apart from that, the troubles I was having in other ways, the debts I owed. I owed everybody I could that would lend me $10 I owed at that point. I don't know how much, but I suppose I've played around with. I guess I must have owed somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 or $50,000 just to all sorts of people, banks to buddies to whomever else. If I'd known you then, I would have sure owed you. I can tell you that. And my deadline thing, that I was 2-3 years beyond when I declared I'd have the book finished, and it got so complicated that I began to have a feeling that a feeling suddenly came to me, or rather gradually came to me, that there was a cure for all of this, the whole thing. I had one thing to do, was raise my other foot, step through that rail, and drop in the sea. And the funny thing was, it didn't alarm me in the slightest. You know, I felt almost euphoric, triumphant. Yeah, that'll fix them all. Everybody. No more problems, no more debts, no more editors, no more nothing, you know. And I was that close to doing that thing. I was no more frightened than anything. And then I had this strange sensation that I heard voices. And they came, it seemed they came a little closer. They hadn't been all that far away to start, but they were speaking very conversationally. And there was no trauma at all about this whole thing. And then I knew just as calmly who they were. They were Kunta Kinte. They were his mother, Binta. They were Kizzy, his daughter. They were Chicken George. They were my grandmother and Tom Lee, and all these people who were my ancestors. And I knew exactly who they were. And they were saying things very calmly like, no, you don't do that. You must finish it, and so forth. It was just a sort of a little fabric of voices. And that thing, man, I'm telling you, I'm standing there and I'm trying to grip the rail. And then it was, I remember with a physical effort, I just thrust myself backward and scuttled like a crab away from that rail, and I went over the hatch covers. I don't know if you know much about ships in the sea, but the hatches are right smack in the middle of the ship. And I went over the hatches because I wanted to keep away from the rails on either port or starboard side. And finally made my way back into my stateroom and just went into a paroxysm of tears. I bet you I cried 3 hours till I was drained. And whereas I normally got down into that hold maybe about 8 o'clock at night, this night it would have been at least midnight when I went back down there, just weak, listless, got down in that hole. And that was the night when for the first time I felt that it was granted, sort of, that I had the right, that I would be able to, in effect, to become Kunta Kinte.
You have to admit, we've learned quite a lot about Alex Haley's roots. Please tell me your thoughts about his book and movie in the comments. I hope to learn more about you from the gemstones I left in this video. Feel free to talk about anything I didn't ask about. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.